Hi, Dr. Roger Handegriff here, and today I wanted to talk to you about something called free trade. Free trade is an important concept for agriculture. It's a concept really that there are two players out there in the markets. There are an exporting market and there are importing markets. So in this video, I wanted to talk today about what is an exporter, what is an importer, and how do they connect together. And what we do is call that, an example of that is called world trade. So an example would be with our world trade, and not an example, but a result is when you have world trade, one of the things we want to talk about is how does that affect price? So price is an important concept in our market. All of our commodities are traded by a price. And an exporter, an example I'm going to say is the U.S., and I'm going to write them over here. And then an importer, I'm going to write them over here. They interact and they are going to give us a new price across the world market. So trade is an important concept. In fact, it's one that gets talked a lot about today. And so in this video, I wanted to kind of see if I could outline the concepts of world trade and then also focus on price. Now to do that, I need you to be an active learner. Take notes along the way. I'm going to draw some graphs up here, basic supply and demand, and then I'm going to talk about how they interact. So if you can take notes along the way, that'll help you retain the concept. All right, I'm going to write here on my board an example of these graphs. And again, you've got a sheet of paper you might want to write. So start on the left-hand side and let's look at what a market looks like. And I'm going to draw simple supply and demand. Nothing very fancy here. Pricing, quantity, typical market. And I'm going to talk about what does it look like if you are an exporter. Now let's talk about what is an exporter. Again, let's look at agriculture as an example. And so our grain products, and I'm going to go here with grains. In fact, I could get a little more specific and let's talk about corn production. So this idea of corn, writing corn here does not look very legible here. So let's write a little bit better, maybe corn. There we go. So an exporter would be an example of the U.S. when we talk about specific items like grains or corn production. And an importer would be someone that has a different situation, and we'll talk about them in a second. But the U.S. is a great example of grain production. However, is the U.S. always an exporter? And the answer is no. We import a lot of goods from other countries that we have decided maybe not to produce, or we don't have the capacity to produce, or we don't have the supply and demand market to produce, but we still do need some of those. So it really depends on the commodity or the item that we are talking about. Some commodities are better produced or harvested in other countries, and we become not an exporter, we become the importer, which we'll get to in a second. So in this example, though, in agriculture is a great one that we talk about the U.S. as an exporter. So what do we look like in agriculture? Well, we have lots of productive land. We have lots of technology. We have lots of investments in materials and resources, in technology and research. And so we end up with not low supply, but high supply. That's what an exporter looks like. Now, supply is an interaction between price and quantity, and we've probably looked over that before. Supply that's really low would be very close to this origin, but it's upward sloping. So the lower the price is, the less people are willing to supply as a quantity. But if prices can get high, we have the technology, the capability, we would produce a lot more. Now, this supply curve is always positive, but is it shaped straight up and down? Does it shift way over here to the right? Because that would be a lot more supply, and that's the answer. It's going to be a very high supply, so I'm going to start off kind of about halfway between my origin, and then I'm just going to go straight up, and I'm going to call that supply. Now, that is what a classic export market would look like. It would be shifted to the right, upward sloping, and that's supply. Now, let's continue to talk about this export market, and I'll switch colors, but you can stay in the same color in your notes. What does demand look like in this export market? Well, demand's going to be high too, so there's nothing wrong with that. We have a lot of demand, we have a lot of product. That's pretty classic. The thing is, this demand curve is going to be not positively sloping anymore, but negatively sloping. So consumers don't want to buy very much if the price is super high. If the price is really low, they're willing to buy a lot more. So you end up with a slope like this. However, I'm going to draw the demand curve very straight up and down, and I'm going to put a D there for demand. Now, why did I draw it very straight up and down? I could have drawn it very sloped like this. The problem is, in the exporting market, we have a demand that is called inelastic. Now, you can think of inelastic, and there's other videos that talk about this, and we've talked about it in other situations, but inelastic means we're not very sensitive to the price changing. In other words, it doesn't change very much. We're not really worried about it. So what you end up with is you end up with a situation where the price is relatively low and the quantity is relatively high. And that is a good example of a classic export situation, meaning we have a lot of quantity already produced. The price is typically very low for us, so suppliers would sure love to hit these other price points. But our demand in the market is such that we're like, corn production. We use it in lots of products. Why do we use it in so many products? Because it's very valuable to use in lots of different areas. However, because it's so valuable to use in lots of different areas, there's other substitutes for protein in feed grains, for example. In our food products, it's used as a sweetener and used as other valuable inputs, as well as used in lots of other even manufacturing aspects. So corn production is a good example, classic example of high supply, inelastic demand creates this kind of situation in this market. Now, that's an exporter. How does that connect to somebody else, which is called an importer? Now, to do this, I'm going to go ahead and draw these lines pretty much the same. Now, I'm going to leave myself a space in the middle, and I'll talk about it last. So on your paper, slide all the way across here, and then let's kind of keep these as best we can to the right. I'm going to go all the way to the right on my board here, and I'm going to draw myself the same kind of supply and demand where you're looking at a price and a quantity again, except this is going to be looking at someone we're going to just call the importer. So this importer, and let's just keep talking about corn is our product. This importer is going to have a different situation. Otherwise, it wouldn't be called an importer. So if they had high supply and they had inelastic demand, like for example, let's say our European partners, they have lots of supply of production of corn. They have lots of demand for the production of corn, very similar to the U.S. So really not a big trade partner in the area of corn. Now, it could be in some other products, but not a massive trade partner. But still, could be trade. It's just the not classic example. All right, so an importer, what is a classic example? Well, an importer is not going to have a high supply shifted over here to the right. They're going to have a supply that's very close to the origin, but they still do have supply, and I'm going to draw it in this situation. So that's supply. Let's keep the same color with demand. What does demand look like for the importer? They still have it, but they are way different as far as sensitive. In fact, I'm going to draw that demand curve not completely flat, but pretty dang flat, because they have what we call an elastic demand, typically. They're very sensitive to price. Even though, let's say that Africa is a large continent, massive population, has plenty of resources for production in agriculture and produces a lot of ag product. In fact, trying to put lots of investments there to get production happen more, but lots of transportations, lots of government issues, lots of just corruption and just lack of capability to get it done. Has the capacity of resources, but doesn't lack the infrastructure like we have in the U.S. for agriculture. So a great example here might be an African country that wants to import corn product because they have very little supply relative to the market, and they have very sensitive consumers to the price. In fact, the price over here in the market, you can see same kind of equilibrium, but at a different spot. We can see they have a very high price, and if we come down here, they have a very low production level. So this is a great example of exporting U.S. market of corn, African country. In fact, let me write that there with Africa. an African country that has the ability to produce but hasn't got logistics and other problems, so they end up with an elastic demand. Their consumers are very sensitive to price, and they end up with not as much production, and that ends up with a very high price and a low quantity of production. Look at all the demand that people would love to buy. Even though it's a high price, they still would love to purchase this. That would get a lot more food over there into that market. So this is a classic example of what does an exporter look like? What does an importer look like? And if you started to make these countries very similar, like the US and Europe, then you kind of start to see not a big difference, but you still could have trade. It's just you don't have a stark difference between the two. All right, so our example, I think, is one to look at. Now, I'm going to put a whole new market in between these. Now, to do that, I'm going to change colors, but it really doesn't matter in the color. I'm going to draw a price and a quantity relationship, just like my other markets did. But this is a whole brand new market. This is called the world market. And we need this market because it helps us connect what is it this country's got to offer as an exporter, and what is it this country's got to need as an importer. So that's the two connections. That really creates a brand new market called the world market. All of the interaction between exporters that have a huge excess and importers that have a huge shortage, that creates a world market. Also, sometimes you have exporters that have an excess and importers that have a little bit of a need. They also still compound to the world market. So the world market is where all this falls in together, but these two examples really give us a good illustration of what this market's all about. And this is really where we end up talking about price. Because these two markets, if they interact together, they create a new market called the world market, and that actually impacts both. All right, so let's look at how that would work. Now you can also take, and I'm going to change colors just to keep them different for my visual, but you're the same here. Let's go over here and start with the importer. If you come over here and look at that price right there, that's where the market is right now. So if I kind of draw myself an arrow over here just to give me a little reference here, this market would pay that price right there. It's the same price they pay. They would pay and import prices, commodities, as long as they were at that price, or I'm going to draw this as a straight line here, lower, and that's called export demand, or you might even call that world demand. But that is demand on this world market. Now, that is where demand comes from. It comes from whoever wants to import the product the exporter has. They are the ones that are going to be the ones that create demand in the world market. Now, who creates supply? Of course, that is going to be the exporter. So they create supply. Where does supply land in this? I'm kind of drawing on my face here. I'm going to come over here, and of course, they sure would love to get rid of. You got suppliers that are like, man, I'd love to be able to get these prices, but our consumers just don't value our corn that much. They have plenty of it. It's not a big deal to them. So this market, and I'm going to continue on with the same concept of export or world supply. So you've got yourself a new market here. This new market has got combinations. The importers provide a demand. The exporters provide a supply. So you end up with a simple supply and demand. Now, supply and demand, we're always looking for something called equilibrium here. Equilibrium means that you've got yourself a new quantity that is going to get traded. And then you've got yourself a new price that it would get traded at. And this is called free trade. So that is called free trade price. And then the world market, this is a free trade illustration. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So when it comes to understanding price, you've got a domestic price and you've got an import price, and these two are very different. But when you get trade happening, you can see what happens here. You end up with a new situation. In fact, if I continue this across the board here, we can just follow all that all the way over. This is now the new price. And so you can see that price goes up for the exporter. And if you come across here to this market, this is the new price. And that is a decrease for the importer. So the question right away was, who likes this? Well, you can imagine pretty quickly, let's start with the exporter, who wins? Well, the price just went up. Consumers aren't happy about that. Consumers don't like high prices. They like low prices. However, remember, they have an inelastic demand. So they're not, maybe not like it, but they sure go ahead and pay it, because the winner over here is going to be the producer. So I'm going to put the producer wins in this market, because the suppliers wanted to give more out there, but they couldn't because the demand was so low. So this price drove it up. So now all of a sudden we get ourselves a new price that we are going to be able to even sell more for. So we're really happy about that. Now let's go over here to the importer. What about win over here? Well, if you're trying to supply, you've got the ability to sell a little bit more, but consumers have a whole lot more demand. We just actually, if you keep going all the way out here, these things are going to hit way out there. We really increased the quantity in this market, and we lowered the price. So who wins over here? I would say that your consumers are the ones that win in this market. Now, this is where free trade would normally exist, and you've got producers really happy about that, and then you've got consumers very happy about this trade. However, here's where policy, government policy, starts to come in, and as they interact with this, they can cause these markets to kind of try to not exist like this anymore. In fact, if you're looking at the export market, and if we are selling our corn to, let's say, Africa, and a country in Africa doesn't want to trade with the U.S. for lots of reasons, they could do things to try to block trade. They could put on tariffs that add taxes to this. So all of a sudden the price didn't drop because they get taxed. So the price gets pushed back up. That's going to cause world trade to pull back. That's going to cause quantity to pull back and cause price to drop over here. Or let's say that the U.S. doesn't want to trade and they actually block trade. They do a quota. We'll only send you so much. Or they do an additional export tax as well. So the importing country could tax it or the exporting country could tax it. But no matter what you do there, hopefully it's logical to figure out. Anything you do that limits trade, producers no longer win, they lose. Anything you do to limit trade, consumers no longer win, they lose. And so when policy happens, you actually can hopefully see the effects. But without policy, free trade is our example here. Free trade causes producers to be the winners here, and free trade causes consumers to be the winner here, and that is how supply and demand would work, and that is the result of price in these markets. As we have market situations that encourage trade, you can bet that prices are going to move up. A great example of this is if you run back to 2009, we ended up in the U.S. with a market crash. Now, it affected the whole world. The whole world had a crash, a financial crisis, but the U.S. probably kind of led the cause. Well, as the U.S. had this market crash, we also injected a lot of money into our economy. That money caused the dollar value, as we tried to increase our market, caused the U.S. dollar value to drop. That actually encouraged trade. And so we had low commodity prices, and then all of a sudden, as our dollar got more attractive, the world trade, free trade, started to work. And all of a sudden prices of our ag commodities shot through the roof because we were able to start shipping more and more product to those importers. So you can see things like money supply, like the value of an exchange rate between countries, labor policy, trade policy, so domestic, international policy, all of these things cause free trade to either go up or go down, and those are some examples. But understanding free trade is really just understanding what does an exporter look like in their supply and demand? What does an importer look like in their supply and demand? And if we don't touch these things and we let them work, this is how free trade works, and this is kind of the effect of price. All right, hopefully this video gives you some insight into free trade. Make sure you review some of the things that I just talked about. Make sure that you answer the questions that are in the description of the video, and it'll help you hopefully better understand this concept of world trade and how it relates to price. Thanks.